Hi guys, welcome back, and today we're going to talk about my winter reading wrap-up. This video comes a little bit late because we've moved away from winter, but I realized that I never did a quarterly wrap-up, and I'm interested in doing seasonal wrap-up videos, and so I wanted to kind of recap what I read this past winter, and since I didn't start my channel until February, I wanted to kind of let you guys know what I was reading before February. So what do I consider winter? There is two different ways that I looked at this. I could either consider winter to be the first quarter of the year, so January, February, March, or I could consider winter to be the months that aligned a little bit more with the season and be December, January, February. And I kind of went back and forth quite a bit, but I decided on the latter. And the reason I decided that was because I feel like it gives me a little bit of a separation from all of the wrap-up videos at the end of the year, so I can do my fall wrap-up and my winter wrap-up and have those be a little bit offset from the yearly wrap-up. Also, I live in an area where the weather changes significantly with the seasons, and so I feel like that kind of affects my mood and in turn affects my reading. And so therefore I decided to do my winter as December, January, and February. So today I'm going to go over what I read in those 3 months. So I read 14 books this winter, which was a really good reading season for me. I really started to kind of get into the swing of the amount of books that I read each month currently, starting in like November, December of last year. Out of these 14 books, I had 1 3-star book, 8 4-star books, and 5 5-star books. Also, 1 was nonfiction and the rest were fiction. 1 was a manga and the rest were traditional novels. 3 were classics, 6 were YA, and 5 were adult. So I had a pretty diverse group of books that I read. 4 of them were audiobooks and the rest were physical or digital copies. I'm going to go over just briefly the books I read and the star ratings I gave them for each month, and then at the end I'll talk about my top 5 for the season a little bit more in depth. So, in December I read Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz, which I gave 4 stars, The Afterlife of Holly Chase by Cynthia Hand, which I gave 4 stars, and A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which I also gave 4 stars. In the month of January, I read 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, which I gave 5 stars. The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, which I also gave 5 stars. Vicious by V.E. Schwab, which I gave 4 stars. Reactive by Becky Moynihan, which I gave 5 stars. And Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody, which I gave 5 stars. In February, I read Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, which I gave 5 stars. The Adventures of Robin Hood by Roger Lancelyn Green, which I gave 4 stars. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which I gave 4 stars. Fairy Tale Volume 1 by Hiro Mishima, which I gave 4 stars. Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, which I gave 4 stars. And The Gilded Wolves by Roshani Chokshi, which I gave 3 stars. So, of those books, the top 5 books that I read in no particular order are as follows. First up, I'm going to talk about Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, which I read and gave 4 stars. This was an adult high fantasy novel that followed a prince, a princess, and a priest, and it also dealt with a disease that made people into a semi-zombie-like form. It dealt with multiple different religions and the interplay among those, as well as some of the prejudices people had for both these religions and the zombie-type creatures and just about each other in general. I really enjoyed this book. It had a lot of different political maneuverings and had really interesting characters, and I loved the inter-character relationships in this book. This book doesn't have as strong of a magic system as some of Brandon Sanderson's other books, and I've also had people describe it as very different from Brandon Sanderson's other books, and while I agree that it is different, it's still very good in its own way. I really enjoyed this story and I thought it was great. Some people say that it's not his strongest work, and while I haven't read all of his other books, and I would agree that it's maybe not my favorite book by him, I still really enjoyed the story. Next up, we have Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, which I absolutely love. I flew through this book. It only took me about a day-ish to read it, and I really liked the magic system and the world, and I enjoyed being back in this world after reading the Six of Crows duology and loving it, and I really liked the characters. I can tell that this book isn't as strong as Six of Crows. You can tell that Leigh Bardugo has grown as a writer, which, I mean, I hope you see in all writers. But I really loved the characters. I thought Alina was a very strong main character, and I liked the interplay with her and the Darkling, even though not a fan of the certain trope that is at play kind of in this book. I did really like the friendships between Alina and some of the other characters, and I thought it was a really strong start to a series. Next up, I want to talk about Reactive by Becky Moynihan. This is a book that I haven't talked about yet on my channel, so I'll go a little more in depth on it. It is a self-published novel, and I will say I am friends with Becky, and I did get to read an early copy of this book as well as reading the finished physical copy. I really liked the setting she created. It felt realistic, like it could be somewhere in our own world, and in fact, I think she used the Biltmore house in South Carolina or North Carolina, in one of the Carolinas, as an inspiration for her setting, and I can totally see how that has shined through. And I love the political system that she created and how Lune, our main character, has to kind of navigate through this. So this story follows Lune, who is a teenage girl who was kidnapped when she was younger and adopted by the supreme elite of Tatum City, and she wants out of the city, but there's only one way to get out of the city, and that is by winning all 3 of the elite trials, which would give her the title of choice in which she could choose what to do with her own destiny. Lune has been training at this since she was young, and there is nothing more she wants than to win the elite trials. And she is on the cusp of competing in these trials when a strange young man comes into the city, and she is tasked by her adoptive father to train him for the elite trials. And he is actually someone from Lune's past, and she has a lot of trouble dealing with that fact. And it is about her and Bren as they train for the trials and try and figure out how to work together yet compete against each other. And there's a romance, and I really liked all of the action. I loved the romance, and I can't wait to see where this story goes next. I really liked how creative some of the tasks were in this book. It definitely had a Hunger Games vibe, but was a story that stood all on its own, and I really liked it and can't wait to see what Becky comes up with next. Next up, I'm going to talk about 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. I read this as a buddy read with Murphy Napier's Patreon group, and it is one of the classics that I have read so far this year, and I really enjoyed this. This is a short book, and it's a quick read. It's a children's book that was published back in the 50s, and it follows the movie pretty closely. It is a tale of 2 Dalmatians who have several puppies, not 101, but several puppies, and these puppies are kidnapped by the evil Cruella de Vil and taken away, and Pongo, the dad, goes to rescue all of these puppies and ends up with even more puppies. So it was a very whimsical children's book. I really enjoyed the whimsy of the book and kind of the way that the author portrayed dogs and how they could communicate with one another. I thought it was a really cute book, and I really enjoyed it. We did have some discussion in our buddy read group about the views on women and on the female dogs in the book, and that they were maybe not quite as smart as the male dogs. And while I do agree and definitely think that you can kind of see that in the writing, if you take into account the time the book was written and published, it makes a little more sense. Still not great, but it is just one factor of the story, and the rest of the story I really loved and really thought was cute. And I am a sucker for anything British, and this book was very, very British. I'm really excited to read other books by Dodie Smith. I know she has I Capture the Castle, which is a very popular book, and I would like to read that book soon to kind of see if I really like her writing style. It was very on the nose and pretty blunt, but I enjoyed it, and I thought it was a great book. So the last book I'm going to talk about is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I read this book back in January. I also read this as a buddy read with Murphy's Patreon group, and man, did I love this book. It captured my heart. It was such a good book. It made me cry. I loved the stories that it told. I absolutely loved the characters. They were so different and portrayed different sides of the war and what women did to survive the war, and I really thought it was incredibly beautiful. I understand that this is a tale that tells many women's stories all wrapped up into two women, and so it kind of seems like maybe there's no way that all of this stuff happened to these two women, but I think Kristen Hanna did a great job of taking lots of different stories from lots of different women and portraying all of them and kind of fitting them all together in a way so that you could see the many different lives that women led during this time. I really loved the book. I know there's been talk about it being turned into a movie, even though nothing has really moved on that in several years. I would love to see this as a movie. It is a pretty big book, and sometimes the pacing jumped around a little bit and kind of threw me off somewhat. But the story as a whole was just really beautiful. I was on the edge of my seat for almost all of it. Parts of it were truly horrific, and I can't even imagine what I myself would have done in some of these situations. And parts of it were just beautiful and told about how humanity lives on even in terrible times. So I really enjoyed The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I highly recommend it, even if you're not the biggest fan of historical fiction. I know it's long, but I think it's worth the read. So that's it. Those are my top 5 books that I read this winter, as well as all of the other books that I read this winter. If you read any of the books that I mentioned, let me know down below and we can chat about them. Also, let me know if the weather and the season affects your reading mood and if it changes anything that you guys read. That is all I have for you today. Thanks for watching, happy reading, and I'll talk to you again soon.